The warning didn't come as a shout, or even as anger. It came quietly, wrapped in polite smiles and lowered voices. The kind of warning that carried more danger than any threat ever could. It was delivered in a private office, with velvet curtains and expensive whiskey untouched on the table, where men in tailored suits spoke as if they were discussing the weather, not a human life. Dean Martin listened without interrupting, his face relaxed, almost amused, as if the words drifting toward him were no more than background noise. But inside him, something had already shifted. Something old, something stubborn, something that had never learned how to step aside when silence became the safer option. "Dean," one of them said carefully, leaning forward, voice calm but final. "This situation doesn't concern you. It's being handled. The best thing you can do is stay out of it." Handled. That word echoed louder than anything else in the room. Dean had heard it before, countless times over the years. It was the word people used when they meant buried, forgotten, erased quietly. So no one powerful ever had to feel uncomfortable. He nodded politely, stood up, adjusted his jacket, and smiled in that effortless way that had made millions feel like he was talking to them alone. "I hear you," he said warmly. And he meant it. He heard every word. But hearing had never been the same thing as obeying. By the time Dean stepped out into the cool night air, the city glowing beneath him like a stage set built for someone else's performance, the decision had already been made. Not because he wanted trouble, not because he believed himself to be a hero, but because once you've seen fear in someone else's eyes, real fear, it becomes impossible to unsee. And Dean Martin had seen it earlier that evening. It had been an ordinary place, the kind no one important ever noticed. A quiet lounge tucked behind the glamour, where waitstaff moved carefully and spoke softly, trained to disappear into the background. Dean had gone there to escape the noise, the expectations, the endless applause that followed him everywhere. He wanted 1 hour where no one asked for anything. That was when he noticed her. She stood near the bar, posture stiff, hands folded too tightly in front of her apron. Her movements were precise, controlled, as if one wrong step might cause something unseen to shatter. She wasn't clumsy, and she wasn't slow. She was cautious in a way that came from experience, not personality. Most people never noticed workers like her. They looked through them, not at them. Dean had spent enough time on both sides of fortune to recognize the difference. When their eyes met briefly, hers dropped instantly. Not out of rudeness, out of instinct. Dean felt it immediately. That subtle signal people carried when they'd learned the cost of being noticed. Later, he would replay that moment again and again. At first, nothing seemed wrong. But then, he heard the voices. Low, sharp, controlled, coming from the corridor behind the lounge. Not loud enough to attract attention, but tense enough to carry weight. Dean didn't intend to listen, but the words reached him anyway. "You were told not to speak," a man said. "I didn't," she replied, her voice tight but steady. "I didn't tell anyone." A pause followed. Heavy, calculated. "You don't decide that," the man answered. "You don't decide anything?" Dean felt the familiar tightening in his chest. Not fear. Recognition. He'd heard that tone before, decades ago. When power leaned too close to cruelty and assumed no one would interfere, the manager appeared moments later. Face flushed, smile forced. Apologizing loudly for the minor disturbance. Everything was fine, he insisted. Always fine. But Dean noticed the way the young woman's hands shook as she returned to her station, the way she avoided eye contact, the way she moved as if the floor beneath her might give way without warning. When Dean asked casually what had happened, an answer came too fast. "Too rehearsed?" "Misunderstanding," she said. "My mistake." That was when he knew. Because people who are protected don't speak like that. Later that night, Dean asked questions. Quiet ones. He learned just enough to understand why the warning had come so swiftly. There were contracts involved, investments, reputations stacked on top of reputations, all fragile in their own way. A single voice, hers, had accidentally crossed into a space it wasn't meant to enter. She had seen something, or heard something. Something that powerful people didn't want remembered, and Dean Martin had been told very clearly that if he interfered, the consequences wouldn't fall on him alone. That was the part meant to scare him. What they didn't understand was that Dean had already lived through loss that no warning could outweigh. He had learned long ago that silence, when chosen for comfort, had a price far higher than inconvenience. So when his phone rang the next morning, and a calm voice repeated the advice firmer this time, Dean listened again. And again, he said nothing in return. But he began making calls of his own. He didn't confront. He didn't threaten. He didn't announce his intentions. Dean Martin knew better than to kick down doors when walls could be moved quietly instead. He asked about policies, about procedures, about who oversaw what. He listened more than he spoke. And slowly, patterns began to emerge. By the end of the day, he understood exactly why everyone wanted him to walk away. That night, Dean sat alone in his home, lights dim, a drink untouched beside him. He thought about the girl's eyes. About how many times he'd walked past similar stories without noticing, wrapped up in his own success. He thought about how easy it would be to do nothing, and how heavy that choice would feel. Tomorrow, people believed courage was loud, that it arrived with speeches and dramatic gestures. Dean knew better. Courage usually arrived quietly. In the moment you realized no one would stop you if you walked away, and no one would thank you if you stayed. The warning echoed in his mind one last time. Don't interfere. Dean exhaled slowly, picked up the phone, made the call that would change everything. Not because he thought he was untouchable, but because he refused to. Believed that kindness was optional, and once that decision was made, there was no turning back. The first consequence arrived quietly, disguised as coincidence. Dean Martin noticed it before anyone else did, because he had lived long enough to recognize patterns when others still believed in chance. A meeting that had been confirmed suddenly needed rescheduling. A call that usually returned within minutes went unanswered for hours. A familiar voice, once warm and open, turned measured and distant, as though every word were now being weighed for risk. Nothing dramatic, nothing obvious. That was how pressure worked at this level, not with force, but with subtraction. Dean sat in his study late that night. The room lit only by a lamp, casting long shadows across framed photographs from another lifetime. Applause, laughter, success, frozen moments that had once felt permanent. He stared at them now with the calm awareness of someone who knew how quickly the world could rearrange itself when invisible lines were crossed. The call he had made the night before had already traveled farther than intended. He hadn't asked for favors. He hadn't made accusations. He had simply asked questions, the kind that made people uneasy, because questions could not be controlled once released. Somewhere between his first inquiry and his second, someone had decided Dean Martin was no longer just an observer. He was becoming a variable. Across the city, the young woman felt it too. She sensed the shift before it was spoken, the way prey often did before danger showed its teeth. The manager no longer raised his voice. He didn't need to. His smile had sharpened instead, stretched thin with patience that felt rehearsed. Her shifts changed without explanation. Her access was limited. Doors that had once been open were now closed, not locked, just not available. Isolation was always the first step when she returned home each night. She checked behind her before unlocking the door, though she couldn't say why. Nothing had happened yet. That was the worst part. Fear thrives in anticipation, in the endless imagining of what might come next. Sleep no longer arrived easily. Silence pressed in from every corner of her small apartment, reminding her how alone she truly was. She had not asked Dean Martin for help. That fact haunted her more than anything else. She remembered the way he had looked at her, not with pity, not with curiosity, but with recognition, as if he had seen something in her worth defending. It frightened her, because attention from someone like him could be protection, or it could be gasoline. She didn't know which one it would become. Dean, meanwhile, received his warning in a different form. An old friend invited him to lunch. someone who had nothing to gain by lying and everything to lose by speaking. The conversation danced around memories at first, nostalgia doing its best to soften what came next. Then the tone shifted. "You're stirring waters that don't need stirring," the friend said quietly, eyes fixed on the table. "I don't say that as advice. I say it as concern." Dean smiled faintly, but he didn't deflect. "People don't warn you unless they're afraid of something." The friend hesitated. "This isn't about fear. It's about control. And you're disrupting it." That word again, control. Dean left the lunch knowing two things for certain. First, the situation was larger than he had been led to believe. Second, someone was already working to contain him. The realization didn't anger him. It sharpened him. Anger was reckless. Clarity was dangerous. That night, Dean changed his approach. He stopped asking questions where they could be traced. He stopped calling names people recognized. Instead, he listened. He observed. He let others speak freely, unaware of how much they were revealing. Over decades in the spotlight, Dean had learned something few people ever mastered: when you made others feel safe. They told you everything, and what he learned unsettled him. This wasn't just about a single mistake or a frightened worker. It was about leverage. About information quietly collected and carefully buried. About people who believed the absence of witnesses was the same as innocence. The young woman had stumbled into something she was never meant to see, and now the machinery had begun turning to erase the problem without noise. Dean understood. The danger now, not just to her, but to himself, interference had a cost. The next morning, it arrived more directly. A representative from a major partnership called Voice, polite, apologetic, rehearsed. Plans were being reconsidered. Timing, they said. Optics, they said. None of it made sense unless you knew how influence worked. Opportunities didn't disappear. They were removed. Dean ended the call and sat in silence for a long time. This was the moment. Most people turned back, not because they didn't care, but because caring had consequences. Because doing the right thing often required accepting losses no one else would see as noble. Dean felt the weight of it settle into his chest, the understanding that continuing forward meant sacrificing comfort, favor, maybe even legacy. For the first time since the warning, doubt whispered, "Was this worth it?" The answer came not as a thought, but as a memory. A much younger Dean. Watching someone else stay silent when speaking could have changed everything. He remembered the regret, not immediate, but permanent. The kind that returned years later, uninvited, asking questions that could never be answered. He stood up. If the cost of interference was isolation, then so be it. If the price of kindness was inconvenience, he would pay it gladly. What he would not pay was the quiet debt of knowing he had looked away. Across the city, the young woman's phone rang, an unfamiliar number. Her heart pounded as she stared at it, instinct telling her not to answer. She hesitated, then picked up. A calm voice spoke her name. "This is Dean Martin," the voice said. "I know you didn't ask for this call, but I need you to listen carefully." Her breath caught. "I can't promise you safety," he continued, honest to the core. "I can't promise this will be easy, but I can promise you one thing: you are not alone." Tears blurred her vision as she gripped the phone, fear and relief colliding inside her chest. That single call changed the equation. From that moment on, the situation was no longer quiet, no longer simple, no longer controllable in the way powerful people preferred, and somewhere, someone realized the warning had failed, because Dean Martin hadn't just interfered, he had committed. The moment Dean Martin hung up the phone, he understood something fundamental had changed, until now. The conflict had lived in shadows, quiet warnings, subtle withdrawals, invisible hands adjusting the world just enough to make a point. But once he spoke to her directly, once he said the words "you are not alone," the balance tipped. Silence was no longer an option for either side, and silence, Dean knew, was the last thing powerful people ever surrendered willingly. The retaliation did not arrive with drama. It arrived with precision. The following morning, headlines appeared that said nothing directly, which was exactly the point. Articles questioning his recent judgment. Anonymous quotes suggesting he was out of touch. Old stories resurfaced, stripped of context and reassembled to imply recklessness where there had once been charm. Nothing false, nothing provable, just enough to plant doubt. Dean read them slowly, without reaction. This wasn't an attack meant to destroy him. Not yet. It was a test. A probe to see whether he would retreat once his reputation became the battlefield. He'd seen this tactic before, watched it break men far younger and less prepared. What unsettled him wasn't the press, it was the timing. Across the city, the young woman walked into work to find her locker empty. No note, no explanation, just absence. Her name had been removed from the schedule. Her access badge no longer worked. When she asked the manager what was happening, his expression remained calm as he told her she was being placed on temporary leave. While an internal review took place, she understood immediately. Temporary meant permanent. Review meant silence. The floor felt unsteady beneath her feet as she left the building for the last time. The familiar walls suddenly foreign. She had known this moment might come, but knowing did nothing to soften the impact. Her hands shook as she stepped outside. The noise of the city swallowing her whole. They were cutting her loose, and now she was exposed. That afternoon, Dean received the message he had been expecting, but still hoped would not come. It wasn't a threat, it was an invitation, a private gathering, exclusive, polite. The kind where deals were shaped behind closed doors. Under the illusion of civility, the message praised his legacy, his influence, his unique ability to inspire. It suggested a conversation, nothing more to clear the air. Dean, he smiled when he read it. They wanted to remind him where power truly lived. He accepted. The room was elegant, deliberately understated. No extravagance, no excess, just quiet confidence, the aesthetic of people who never needed to prove they belonged. Dean was greeted warmly, as if nothing had changed. Laughter flowed easily at first. Stories shared with practiced familiarity. Then the conversation shifted. "Dean," one man said, swirling his glass thoughtfully, "you've always stood for kindness, for empathy. That's admirable. But sometimes empathy can cloud judgment." Dean met his gaze evenly. "Sometimes judgment clouds empathy." A pause followed. Calculated. Another voice joined in, smoother this time. "We're concerned you're being misled. People exaggerate. They misunderstand situations far larger than themselves." Dean leaned back slightly. "Funny thing about misunderstandings," he said calmly. "They tend to disappear when transparency shows up." The air cooled. They didn't argue. They didn't deny. They simply redirected, offering alternatives, distractions, compromises. Opportunities that would require his attention elsewhere. Invitations to step back with dignity intact. Dean listened patiently, and then he declined every single one. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just clearly. That was when the tone changed. "You're risking more than you realize," someone said quietly. "Not everyone will be as forgiving as we are." Dean stood. "I didn't come here for forgiveness," he replied. "I came to make sure you understood something. I won't be intimidated into silence." No one stopped him as he left. They didn't need to, because the real pressure was waiting elsewhere. That evening, Dean learned the young woman had been contacted by a legal representative she did not recognize, offering a settlement in exchange for a signature and a promise of confidentiality. The amount was large, life-changing. The language was friendly. The message was clear. Take the money. Disappear quietly. Dean felt anger rise for the first time. Not explosive, but cold and focused. This wasn't about resolution. It was about erasure. They wanted her reduced to a footnote, a transaction. A problem solved neatly and permanently. He called her immediately. She answered on the first ring. "They offered me something," she said softly, before he could speak. "Enough to make all of this go away." Dean closed his eyes briefly. "And what do you want?" There was a long pause. I want the truth to matter, she said. Even if it costs me. Dean felt something tighten in his chest. Respect mixed with concern. Courage was never convenient, and it was never free. Then we do this the right way, he said. Together. From that moment forward, the strategy shifted again. Dean brought in people who couldn't be bought easily, individuals who valued integrity over access. He documented everything. Timelines, conversations, patterns. He made sure that if pressure escalated, so would exposure. And it did. Whispers turned into warnings. Warnings into veiled threats. Doors closed faster now. Friends advised him to stop returning calls. Invitations vanished altogether. The isolation was deliberate, but so was Dean's resolve. One night, alone in his home, he looked out over the city lights and acknowledged the truth. He could no longer ignore. They were no longer trying to discourage him, they were trying to break him, and if they succeeded, the young woman would vanish into silence shortly after. Dean picked up the phone again, not to call for help, but to prepare for impact. Because once powerful systems feel threatened, they don't retreat, they strike, and the next move would not stay hidden. The breaking point did not arrive with sirens or shouting, it arrived with stillness. Dean Martin sat alone in a quiet room just before dawn. The city outside barely awake, the world suspended in that brief hour where everything felt undecided. On the table before him lay a neat stack of papers, timelines, notes, statements, fragments of truth collected patiently over weeks. Nothing sensational, nothing exaggerated. Just facts placed carefully beside one another until a picture emerged that could no longer be ignored. This was the moment. He understood that once he crossed this line, there would be no soft landings left. No polite invitations. No gradual pressure. Everything would become immediate, visible, and irreversible. Dean had spent a lifetime learning how to read rooms, how to sense when to step forward and when to step back. This room, empty and silent, offered no guidance, only choice. Across the city, the young woman sat on the edge of her bed, fully dressed, though she had nowhere to go. Sleep had abandoned her days ago. Her phone rested in her hands. Unread messages piling up from numbers she didn't recognize, some offering help, others pretending concern, all circling the same unspoken demand: be quiet. Disappear. She thought of her mother. Of all the times she'd been told that survival depended on keeping your head down. She thought of how close she had come to accepting the settlement, how tempting it had been to choose safety over uncertainty. No one would have blamed her, but something inside her refused to settle. Not after Dean's call. Not after realizing someone had finally seen her as more than collateral damage. The phone vibrated. Dean's name. I need you to hear this from me first, he said gently. What happens today will be loud, and it will be uncomfortable. But I won't do it without your consent. She closed her eyes. If we don't do it now, she replied, voice steady despite the fear, it will never happen. Dean exhaled slowly. Then it's time. The release was not dramatic. No press conference. No grand speech. Just information delivered to the right places, in the right order, by people whose credibility could not be dismissed. The story unfolded methodically, like a door opening inch by inch, until light flooded in. At first, the response was denial, then distraction, then outrage, carefully aimed. Strategically loud, but the facts didn't bend. By mid-morning, the tone changed. Statements were issued. Internal reviews announced. Language softened, then scrambled, as those who once controlled the narrative realized they were now reacting instead of directing. The system that had relied on silence found itself exposed by patience. Dean watched from a distance. He did not comment. He did not celebrate. He understood something essential. This was not about winning. It was about refusing to lose what mattered. The backlash came swiftly. Projects dissolved overnight. Endorsements vanished. Old allies distanced themselves with practiced neutrality. Dean's name became polarizing, spoken with admiration by some and irritation by others. He felt the weight of it, every bit. Loss always made itself known, but so did something else. Messages began arriving from unexpected places. People he had never met. Workers, assistants, strangers who saw their own stories reflected in his stand. Quiet gratitude replaced applause, and Dean found it far more sustaining. The young woman faced her own storm. Her name appeared briefly, then disappeared again, this time by choice. Protected by people who now understood the stakes, she was no longer alone. Support arrived not in promises but in presence. Legal help, counseling, options. For the first time since the ordeal began, she felt her shoulders lower, just a fraction. One evening, weeks later, she met Dean in person again, not in a grand space, not under bright lights, just a quiet cafe where no one paid attention. They sat across from each other, two people bound not by fame or circumstance, but by a shared decision. "I don't know how to thank you," she said finally. Dean shook his head. "You already did. You told the truth." She hesitated. "You lost a lot," he smiled softly. "I kept what mattered." They sat in silence for a moment, the kind that no longer felt threatening. Outside, the world continued, imperfect, loud, unresolved. Dean knew the system had not collapsed. It never did. But it had shifted, just enough to remind those watching that power did not always win by default. Sometimes, it was challenged by someone who refused to look away as they parted ways. Dean felt something settle inside him, not pride, not relief, but alignment. The rare comfort of knowing that when history asked where he stood, he wouldn't have to search for the answer. He had interfered, and in doing so, he had proven something quietly profound. That kindness, when chosen deliberately, was not weakness. It was resistance.